So let's start with a huge question. What if the deadliest pandemic in human history just never happened? How would that single massive change ripple through time to shape the world we're all living in today? You've probably heard the popular version of this story. It's this incredible tale of total destruction that somehow leads to this miraculous rebirth. A horrifying catastrophe that, almost by accident, set the stage for our modern world. Yeah, the thinking goes that the plague was basically this grim cosmic reset button. By wiping out something like half the population, it completely shattered the old, rigid system of feudalism. And that, in turn, supposedly unleashed all the creativity of the Renaissance and, put Europe on the fast track to everything that came next. It's a really compelling story. But what if that neat, tidy little story of progress being born from tragedy just isn't the whole truth? What if the Black Death wasn't the catalyst we think it was, but something else entirely? That's exactly what we're going to dig into. First, let's just get away from the myth and talk about the brutal reality of what people at the time called the Great Mortality. Because to really understand its effects, you have to grasp the sheer, terrifying, and completely random scale of what happened. So, modern research puts the overall death rate in Europe at around 40%. Just let that number sink in for a second. 40%. It's a shock to the system on a scale that's almost impossible to imagine and totally unprecedented in recorded history. And behind that cold, hard statistic are millions of just gut-wrenching personal tragedies. This quote from a writer in Siena, Italy, really brings it home. I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. For the people who lived through it, this wasn't some neat historical turning point. It was the apocalypse. And here is a really crucial point. The plague was indiscriminate. All the data we have shows it wasn't a disease that just targeted the poor or the unhealthy. No, it cut across all social classes, all ages, all levels of health. In fact, the idea that the poor died more than the rich is, as one academic puts it, a plausible-sounding statement rather than an independent scientific conclusion. Basically, nobody was safe. Okay, so with that horrifying reality in mind, let's start testing the claims of that popular story. And we have to start with the biggest one of all, the Renaissance. So the simple story goes that the shock of the plague directly led to this incredible explosion of art and humanism. But is that actually true? Was the medieval world just some kind of cultural dark age right up until the year 1347? Well, when you actually look at the timeline, it gets really interesting. The seeds of the Renaissance weren't just planted. They were already growing for decades before the plague ever hit Italy. I mean, way back in the 1260s, you have Nicola Pisano creating these sculptures with clear classical Roman influences. By 1305, Giotto is painting these revolutionary frescoes that are a complete break from medieval tradition. And get this, just 2 years before the plague, Petrarch, the father of humanism, rediscovers Cicero's letters. The Renaissance was already happening. All right, next up, let's look at another part of the myth. This idea that the plague broke the church's supposed stranglehold on science and reason. The myth paints the medieval church as this villain that's holding back all scientific progress. But the reality on the ground was way more complicated and honestly a lot more interesting. The church was actually the main center of learning. It sponsored what they called natural philosophy, which is basically the precursor to modern science. And the motivation wasn't to suppress knowledge. For many, it was driven by the idea that to understand nature is to understand God. It's a little counterintuitive for us today, but that deeply religious impulse is what actually fueled a ton of scientific inquiry back then. Okay, so if the plague didn't kickstart the Renaissance or magically free science from religion, what about the economy? Is this where the story is actually true? Did it cause an economic revolution? Well, on this point, the popular story is largely correct. The plague caused an absolutely catastrophic drop in the labor supply. In just a few years, the workforce was slashed by up to 40%. This was, without a doubt, the single biggest shock the medieval economy had ever seen. So the crucial thing to understand is the chain reaction this set off. All of a sudden, with way fewer workers to go around, the survivors had immense bargaining power. They could demand higher wages, better conditions, more freedom. This new economic leverage was a massive, massive factor in the slow-motion collapse of serfdom across much of Western Europe. So yeah, on the economic front, the plague's impact was truly revolutionary. Okay, so where does all this leave us? If the plague didn't cause all these changes, but it clearly did something huge, what was its real role? This is where we can start to piece together a new, more accurate story. The best way to think about it is this. The plague was not an originator. It was a brutal, indiscriminate accelerant. It took trends that were already in motion, like the artistic shifts of the early Renaissance and the slow decay of feudalism, and just threw gasoline on the fire. It didn't create a new road, but it violently changed the speed and the character of the journey. Take art, for example. The artistic innovations were already there, but the experience of the plague completely warped them. A cultural obsession with death took hold. You see the rise of the danse macabre, the dance of death, which is this recurring image of skeletons leading everyone from popes to peasants in one final dance. The message was so powerful and so direct. Death is the ultimate equalizer. The Renaissance continued, but now it was being filtered through this dark, traumatic lens of the plague. So why do we hang on to that old story? Why are we so determined to find a positive, progressive outcome from one of history's absolute worst catastrophes? Well, I think it's because we just love simple stories of progress. We want to believe that the Renaissance led neatly to the Enlightenment, which then led to our modern enlightened values. But history is never that clean. I mean, this is a quote from Immanuel Kant, a central figure of the Enlightenment, and he developed this elaborate and deeply racist hierarchy of humanity. It really challenges that simple idea that history is just one long, straight line of improvement. And that's really the ultimate takeaway here. The Black Death wasn't a silver lining. It was a horrific tragedy that accelerated some changes and twisted others. And trying to force a simple, positive lesson onto it completely misses the point. The real value of studying an event like this isn't to make ourselves feel better about the past. It's to challenge our own assumptions about how history actually works, and to embrace the messy, complex, and often uncomfortable truth.